Welcome to the Rutgers University Newark SPAA Writing Method Series. This seminar is going to focus on strong openings and writing to persuade. Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you would persuade, you must appeal to interest rather than intellect." We want to focus this seminar on catchy openings because while public administration informs, persuades, and entertains the audience, openings are the place where writers can create strong first impressions, set structure for the rest of the work, and develop a strong voice for their target audience. In order to keep an active voice, the opening paragraphs provide the most space for expression, and also concluding paragraphs can serve the same function. To begin, always read the instructions. Use the syllabus and assignment prompts as guides when writing papers or doing projects. Always follow the instructions, use structure and the assignment itself as a guide to developing your writing style. Use appropriate professional language and also the appropriate tone for the assignment at hand. There's a variety of assignment types in public administration. We ask commonly for students to write research papers, response papers, memos, budget proposals, as well as perform research projects, including the capstone, or perform large group projects with each other. Because there's so many different assignment types, the best thing for a student to do is make sure that they understand the assignment in its most basic sense, what type of structure needs to be in the work, but also students can ask their professors for samples of work in case they're interested in different ways that they can bring their points across in similar fashion. So why do we add narrative elements to public administration work? Well, there's a perception that public administration work is often dry, it's voluminous, it is dense, it's long, and it's difficult to read technical language. Further, the vocabulary itself in a work can be really overwhelming. So what we want to do by adding a narrative element is remain informative, be accurate, and use evidence-based research to really support our ideas. We put these ideas into the context of the work we're doing. And we also focus on the process of getting the work done. In this way, we can add length to the paper while also providing the reader with an entry point that allows them to understand and comprehend the information that's before them. We frame the work in any given work in the introduction and in the conclusion. Now, there's a few basic things that were covered in writing a strong research paper that should be noted here as well. We can start with an epigraph, an opening quotation, and that's an optional way to begin the hook. But we want to make sure to hook the reader with an interesting opening, introduce the topic to the reader, as well as any important authors and sources that have helped contribute to the paper. Further, we want to establish themes that are going to run throughout the work, and we want to establish a thesis sentence or primary argument that really focuses on the core ideas of the paper. From the 5-paragraph essay structure, we use 3 main ideas, but these 3 ideas may actually expand into sections of the paper rather than individual paragraphs. Further, a conclusion is usually required in most assignments. This should be a restatement of ideas, an additional inclusion of final thoughts and recommendations, and if a hook began the paper, then this is an opportunity to close that hook and provide a sense of closure. The hook's job is to hook the audience, and we typically do this through famous quotes, storytelling, personal anecdotes, as well as interesting and shocking statistics and data. We might also propose interesting questions that we want the reader to consider as they read the work, establishing a sense that the element of persuasion is starting from the very beginning. Hooks can also be used to bookend the conclusion to provide the closure that we were talking about a moment ago. When introducing a topic, explain the main ideas of the work. Use key descriptive information, establish key themes, and create a strong primary argument, thesis sentence, or research question according to the project that you're doing. It's also important to mention that when it comes to approaching an idea, you can start in one of two basic ways. You can begin with the broad idea and then narrow into the details, adding length to the paper, or you can build a case with small details that lead to a greater understanding of a bigger picture. When it comes to persuasive ideas, we want to keep this simple when we begin the writing process. We want to ask what, so what, and now what? What information is most important in this particular work? So what? What's the significance of the information in regards to the thesis sentence or the primary argument? And then now what? Knowing what we do now, what action or further understanding needs to take place for the audience member to really gain a sense of what the author is getting at. Flow is a really important concept to establish early on in the paper. This can be established in the outline stage. And we see it in the outline stage specifically because we want to be able to move major elements of the paper about, and it's easier to do that from an outline, a skeleton of what the work looks like, as opposed to working with paragraphs at a time. So when we establish a flow, the main ideas are going to find their way into the introduction as we've talked about. The body paragraphs are where the main ideas introduced are going to be fleshed out. If a paper has three main ideas, each body paragraph should subsequently address each individual point. Once that's concluded, in the conclusion itself, the key ideas will be restated and the final thoughts can be presented. If there are recommendations that answer the original question posed, readers are welcome to bring those back into the introduction, to bring the reader's attention back to where we began so that the element of persuasion can conclude. There's different types of openings, and this next sequence is designed to focus on just a few of the ways that students can make their work more interesting. The narrative opening is based around the concept of basic storytelling. Storytelling is a really powerful tool. It's not just useful in fiction, it's also useful in nonfiction. Narrative openings set the stage for the remainder of the paper. They quickly allow the author to express appealing and complex ideas in a way that is digestible to the reader. They can also be used to explain the history or sequence of events, and develop details about individuals, groups, or organizations where a more technical approach might be too large or too complex to be easily understood by the target audience in the allotted time and space. Also, narratives are used frequently to talk about people's lives through memoirs and biographies. It's useful for persuasive writing when it comes to fundraising, developing, and marketing. And narratives are useful to recognize when they're going on whenever you're reading any sort of content, because if a narrative appeal is being used, there could be a good reason by the author you're reading. It would be very helpful as a researcher to identify what type of appeal the author is using so that you can then establish whether you should do the same. Informational openings are straightforward. It's expository writing. Exposition is explanation, and what is necessary is a statement of the topic. The statement will be opened and supported with necessary relevant information. That is to say that if the topic can't be explained in a sentence, use as much language as is necessary to express what's happening, and introduce and define all important terms that will be used throughout the work on a regular basis. Also, the informational opening can establish parameters for the topic of discussion. If the topic is based around local government, for example, that can be established early on so that all other discussions about state and federal matters can be tabled for this particular work. Whereas if it happens to be a discussion that's perhaps a comparison between states, that can be established early on before the reader has any expectations about what they will read. This is actually an opportunity for readers to bring in specific details about the relevant information they're looking at. It should be noted that general information about the functions of government, theoretical information about the function of government, are different than specific information in real time concerning issues that are being managed by public administrators in a contemporary sense. The more specific the details, the longer the work will be. Further, in the informational opening, authors can use terms that will allow the reader to understand the process of the assignment, and this can also add length to the paper. Journalistic openings usually start with strong headlines. Journalistic articles will begin with the critical information for their specific audiences, and the most important information is going to be prioritized. The remaining relevant information is listed in the article as it is built around the core information. Typically, you'll note that the information found in journalistic articles don't end with conclusions very often, and that's because of the limited space that they have and the focus of their approach. Journalistic openings also seek to focus on the questions who, what, where, when, why, and how. This how can be extended to how often or how much or how many, but the idea behind a journalistic opening is that it allows the reader to focus on what is priority and then allows the author to move beyond the journalistic story and get back into public administration topics very quickly. Shocking openings are designed to get the reader's attention. You can shock them with events, you can shock them with facts, you can shock them with statistics. They're used to emotionally engage readers immediately, and typically they're very powerful calls to action. Emotional appeals are also a rather strong way to open a particular public administration document. Typically, we focus on the human element to appeal to people's sense of compassion, empathy, or generosity. We use narratives about individuals, groups, and organizations to focus on different causes they might support. Further, case studies can serve as a representative sample of larger issues. And so emotional appeals can be useful for persuasive writing. It can be used for marketing. It could be used for grants. It could be used as a form of recruitment. The idea behind appealing to your audience emotionally is to make sure that you understand what your audience wants, needs, or concerns are, and then you establish your writing by focusing on the interests of the audience members in ways that would be most appealing to them toward future goals. What exactly do you want them to do? What are you trying to teach them? What are you trying to convince them? Emotional appeals can be powerful, but you want to make sure if you do use them that you don't use them in place of the critical information that we need in the documents for public administration. So how do you do all of this? The major element that is universal in our writing style is simplifying your writing style tends to clarify a lot of issues. We want to focus on understanding and making sure that the reader comprehends the information that's available. In order to do that, it's oftentimes best to use shorter words, use as opposed to utilize, simply because the word use can be used more often and in more context than a term like utilize. Short sentences as opposed to long. Please note that you are not being graded on the length of your sentences, and you're not being graded on the complexity of your word choices. So that means that long sentences with multiple clauses can often be broken into short declarative sentences that carry the same weight. Also, if short sentences are used, they can always be combined into compound or complex sentences, and they can also be great ways to add more information in. If you happen to have a document that you're working on, you happen to be proofreading it or editing it, and the sentence structure is too long or too complex, break the sentences up into a few different ideas. This will not only allow you to add more details and length, it might also allow you to add more numerous shorter paragraphs that will carry the same message, but with much more detail. If you have any questions about these strategies, I would highly recommend making an appointment with the Writing Center because these techniques are best practiced with your specific writing style. We also want to avoid slang, acronyms, or jargon. Public administrators are famous for this. Essentially, when it comes to government language, it's very common to use acronyms, very common to use shorthand for policy discussions, very common to talk about procedure in ways that the layman may not necessarily understand, that your audience members may not necessarily understand. And so it's oftentimes important to make sure that at least the first time new information is mentioned, before the acronym is used, the entire idea is spelled out. Also, be careful when it comes to informal text and informal shortcuts that are common in text messaging and emails and social media. Effectively, these shortcuts don't belong in public administration papers. If you happen to use the letter U as opposed to spelling the word YOU, that's a habit that you want to note and try to eliminate as best you can. But if the question is usually in the element of formal versus informal, you are better off aiming for a more formal discussion than an informal one. Now, this requires a slight bit of explanation, but we want to aim to create a style that's conversational, one that identifies an issue, clarifies its elements, and explains what it means in the context of our argument. But even though we want to be conversational, we'd like to avoid writing like we speak. What we mean in this case is commonly used phrases, also weird pauses, stops, and starts that are very common when we speak. Oftentimes, in order to be objective, the writer only needs to take themselves out of it. If you eliminate I, me, my, we, us, our, and that level of personalization, oftentimes you'll find that what's left are the core subject and key ideas left in the sentence. At that point, if you have written something that sounds like it belongs in a speech or sounds as if you were explaining it to a friend, then in the editing process, make sure to clean up that information. Ways to do that would be to eliminate filler words, eliminate glue, eliminate prepositional phrases that aren't going anywhere. And this is something that we covered in the last seminar. Essentially, when expanding your analysis, the idea is to focus on keywords and phrases in a sentence that give it meaning. Everything that's not core to the meaning of the sentence can more than likely be simplified in the editing process. If you have questions about this, please make an appointment with the Writing Center. We'd be happy to help. Further, to add detail to your work is the element of scope and scale. These are consistently ways to expand the length of your paper, but also make sure that if you provide scope and scale, you also cite the information. Descriptive details are important. That is the who, what, when, where, why that we were talking about earlier from the journalistic approach. Also, adding specific data-driven information can be important. Demographic information from the US Census, for example, information such as population, educational background, or household income of different regions could be core to your paper and is always useful to us, the readers. Financial data is usually an important element, and making sure that it's in the correct currency type if it's international is always appreciated. Polling data, including percentages and proportions of population surveyed from any given poll that is well recognized, is usually going to be a great way to add analysis to your work and gain another angle that may not come just from the straight information from an organization. Further, statistical data can be useful to us. Just make sure that it's analyzed in the context of the paper so that the readers understand what's going on. And also use specific details to add length to research papers in the context that the reader will understand them. So what this means is that generally, if it takes more than a few sentences to get an idea across, it's okay to continue to add details that will provide context for the uninitiated. When it comes to the tone of writing, don't bury the lead. Make sure that whatever was priority, whatever the purpose of the paper being written is, it stays in the most critical places for the paper structure. That is in our thesis sentences, that is in our topic sentences, and that is in our intro and conclusion. Make sure that you engage the reader. If you find that you have written a paragraph that has tons of data, the paragraph is very long and it's difficult to follow, simplify the writing. APA format allows for charts, it allows for graphs, it allows for tables. Also, if the data is very tedious and you still have to put it in a form that is not going to be clear to the reader necessarily, make sure to introduce the data before you present it in the paper, and then also make sure to analyze it after the fact. Stories are about people. Human interest is more interesting. In this case, make sure, as with the Ben Franklin quote from the beginning of this seminar, make sure to appeal to a person's interests as opposed to just their academic or intellectual understanding. In the human interest elements, we can find much stronger, more appealing writing that is also persuasive. Use active voice as opposed to passive voice. In this example, an active voice. We studied the pandemic versus a passive voice. The pandemic was studied. We, the subject, studied the verb, the object, the pandemic, versus the object being studied by the subject. Good academic writing does not need to sound or look academic. It needs to be clear. It needs to have an explanatory element to it or a persuasive element to it. It needs to meet your project's objectives, but it doesn't have to be filled with academic sounding language, level 5 GRE words, really advanced technical language from the course itself. Make sure that if you are using language that the reader will understand, that you keep in mind what level you're writing for, and make sure that the reader, when you're expressing it to them, you're giving it to them in a context that furthers their knowledge. So you should be able to ideally explain a public administration concept to a person who's not necessarily in the program or doesn't necessarily understand the intricacies of public policy. However, at the same time, you should still be able to explain that same concept to your professor or your colleagues or your bosses. Make sure to present, if the argument has more than one angle, every side of the argument. If there's two core sides, express both. You don't have to favor one or the other, but you can, so long as it's evidence-based. Remember, we're looking for evidence-based research. It's not your opinion. You're not saying I think, I feel, or I believe. Instead, you're presenting an argument that establishes what all relevant sides are saying, why they're saying it, and how it relates to the core idea being presented in the work. Make sure that once the work is complete, you proofread. So in this order, finish the work, take a break, and then review. Leave time to review the final draft, but also make sure that you have left enough time to pause. If you go directly from writing your work into trying to edit your work, you may find that you don't catch as many different things. So if you have an opportunity to take a 15-minute break, if you have an opportunity to take a break for half a day or even overnight, please do before you look at it again, because fresh eyes allow you to see more. There's two types of proofreading you can do while you're looking over your work in its final form. When you're proofreading for narrative cohesion, you are reading for consistency, making sure that everything in the work makes sense, making sure there's no strange contradictions or there's no strange issues with the way that things were presented. Oftentimes, when moving things around in the editing process, you can find that narrative cohesion may suffer a bit. So that's why you give it a final read through, just to ensure that it flows well. Then further, you should read for grammar and syntax. This means ensuring that there's no technical mistakes, that's spelling, punctuation, etc. But also, you're reading to make sure that the sentence structure and the organization of the paper as a whole is flowing well. Once your papers are completed and you're satisfied with the work, you've turned it in and you've received a grade, the final thing to do is after you have received the grade, make the updates that your professors have designated, and then save your work into an academic portfolio. Remember to save it into academic files on your PC or Mac and label the work so it's easily identifiable. You may find that there's new research that you'd like to pursue later in the program, or even after the program concludes, that you can build upon later. My name is Terry Hall. I'm the director of SPAA's Graduate Writing Center. If you have any questions for me, my contact information can be found here, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.